So let's get started then. Hope everybody is enjoying their long weekend and the nice weather. And hopefully there's good news for us just around the corner. So I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Okay. So the topic or the title that I chose for this evening's shir is Shalosh Regalim, a lesson in synthesis. But so, once I saw it on paper, the truth of the matter is I wasn't terribly excited about it. I don't know. Evidently, it didn't turn you guys off too much, but a lesson in synthesis to me, wasn't the most exciting title, that one could come up with for a shir. So, some other ideas I had, and you can actually see this one on your source sheet, was goats, milk, and modern orthodoxy. And this one I thought was totally out there, but cooking, didn't think that one was terribly appropriate. But both of them sort of get to the crux of what I'd like to do with you this evening, which is to take a journey into a topic that we know pretty well, which is the Shalosh Regalim, and see that there's a lesson in there. There's an idea, there's a concept or a way of thinking about the Shalosh Regalim that has quite a bit of relevance for the world that we live in today, for the way we see the world we live in today. And we're going to use it as a launching point to actually distinguish between some of the thinking that has happened primarily in the 20th century around the ideas of synthesis, which have in many ways formed the bedrock of what is often referred to as modern orthodoxy today. So let's start at the beginning. There are two times within close proximity to one another in Sefer Shemot that we encounter the Shalosh Regalim. And there's a curious passage that appears almost verbatim after each one of these introductions to the Shalosh Regalim. And you see the first one in front of you here, Shalosh Pamim Bashana Yera'eh Kol Zechorcha El Panei Adon Hashem. So 3 times a year. This comes at the end of the description of all of the Shalosh Regalim. And after having described them, there's this summary paragraph, which says 3 times a year, every male should go and come before our master Hashem. Lo tizbach al chametz dam zivchi v'lo yalin chelev chagi ad boker. You shall not leave my sacrifice. You should not put the sacrifice with anything that is leavened, with chametz on the mizbeach. You should not leave the korban on the mizbeach until the morning. Reishit bikurei ad marchat havi beit Hashem elokecha lo tavashel gedi b'chalev imo. You should bring the first fruits to the house of Hashem, to the Beit HaMikdash, and you should not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Right? So again, we have a description of the Shalosh Regalim. It ends with this summary, and then these 4 halachot. If we skip just 4 prakim later, not 4 prakim later, 11 prakim later, from Kaf Gimel to Lamed Daled, in Sefer Shemot, we once again have a reference to the Shalosh Regalim. Shalosh Pamim Bashana Yera'eh Kol Zechorcha Panei Adon Hashem Elokei Yisrael. 3 times a year, every male should see Hashem Elokei Yisrael. And then immediately following, once again, these same 4 laws. Lo tishchat al chametz dam zivchi, no chametz on the mizbeach. Lo yalin laboker zevach chag haPesach. This is a slight change. Before it said you can't leave any korban over until the morning, and here it says specifically chag haPesach. Reishit bikurei ad marchat havi. Bring the first fruits. Beit Hashem lokecha lo tavashel gedi b'chalev imo. Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And of course, we know this last pasuk is the foundation for what halacha? Somebody unmute themselves, jump in so I know you're there. Lo tivashel gedi b'chalev imo.
Kashrus.
Okay, very good. Right, not eating meat and milk together, which forms the backbone of much of our practice around kashrut. Okay, so the question that emerges is a pretty simple one. We have 4 laws. Right? No chametz on the mizbeach. Don't leave the korban on the mizbeach until the morning. Bring the first fruits to the Beit HaMikdash, and do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And the question is, what is the connection between these 4 halachot, these 4 psukim, or these 4 mitzvot that appear in these psukim, and the Shalosh Regalim? They are clearly connected. They appear in the same parshiot, in the same paragraphs, and twice in quick succession after one another. Describes the Shalosh Regalim, what we do on each of the Shalosh Regalim, and we have these 4 laws. Again, describes the Shalosh Regalim, and we have these 4 laws. So what is the connection between the two? So some of them seem to have a pretty obvious connection, right? But others are a little bit more difficult. So which are the obvious ones? Go ahead, jump in. Which are the ones that seem to be obviously connected to the Shalosh Regalim?
Pesach and Shavuot.
Okay, so law number 1, no chametz, right, seems to be connected to Pesach, and number 3 seems to be connected to Shavuot, bringing the bikurim. Good. We saw that in the second iteration of this, it actually referred to the korban Pesach and not the korbanot in general. So maybe there's a connection there as well. What about number 4? What is the connection of not cooking a kid in its mother's milk with this Shalosh Regalim? What is the connection?
Very, very mysterious.
Very mysterious. Okay. I think that was Stephen. Good. Does anybody want to venture a guess? Dead silence. Okay. I want to suggest an answer. Well, not suggest my own answer, but show you an answer that's been offered that I think is really quite interesting, especially when we see what was originally said with our Rishonim and what has been found in archaeological evidence since. So the answer begins with a pasuk in by the first of the paragraphs around the Shalosh Regalim that we looked at, and the Ibn Ezra's comments thereon. So the pasuk says, Shalosh Regalim tachog li bashana. You should have 3 regalim for me during the year. Pasuk on the face of it doesn't necessarily come off as particularly problematic, but the Ibn Ezra picks up on a very a nuance in this pasuk, which is tachog li. It doesn't say tachogu, doesn't say tachog, it doesn't say you shall celebrate 3 regalim during the year, but you shall celebrate 3 regalim for me during the year. And the Ibn Ezra, who we know is a close reader and a pashtan, one who values a simple and straightforward reading of the text, says as follows: V'hiskir zeh ba'avur ki yesh yamim yeduim holchim ovdei elilim lehevlehem al kein katuv tachog li levad. Why does the pasuk go out of its way to say you shall celebrate 3 regalim for me? Says the Ibn Ezra, simple. Because there were 3 regalim. Before we ever got a Torah, before we were ever commanded around Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, there were 3 regalim. And Ovdei Avodah Zarah used to celebrate 3 regalim because, after all, they correspond to the 3 major years of the times in the agricultural cycle, and this was an agrarian society. So of course they celebrated at the beginning, right? In the spring, as things began to grow, they celebrated in the beginning of the harvest, and they celebrated at the end of the harvest. There were 3 regalim before the Torah ever came about, says the Ibn Ezra. But what would happen in the ancient Near East on these 3 regalim? Well, they would get together and they would celebrate them for their elilim, for their avodah zarah. So they would come together and they would bring gifts for the rain god, for the sun god, for the whatever it might be. Right? And so Ibn Ezra says that's why the Torah had to go out of its way to say these regalim, sure, you can have them, but celebrate them for me. Now, the Rambam in his Mor Nevuchim describes something that isn't necessarily seen as similar, but I think we'll see the connection in just a moment. He is bothered by the whole idea of lo tevashel gedi b'chalei v'imo. What does this pasuk mean, and how does it come to form the backbone of kashrut? And so the Rambam writes that when it comes to this isur of eating meat that is boiled in its parents and its mother's milk, he writes as follows: meat boiled in milk is undoubtedly fatty food, right? And makes one overfull. But I think that most probably it is also prohibited because it is somehow connected with idolatry. This is a common theme for the Rambam in his Mor Nevuchim, that many of the mitzvot that we have are actually intended to kind of wean us off of practices of idolatry. So he thinks, says the Rambam, that this is probably, this actual act of boiling a kid in its mother's milk was probably something that was done, perhaps as part of a service, he says, or being used on some festival of the heathen. I find a support for this view in the circumstance that the law mentions the prohibition twice after the commandment given concerning the festivals. That is, the fact that this pasuk, which says, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk, comes after two descriptions of the festivals, suggests to the Rambam that perhaps this was connected to the festivals of the ancient Near East, of these idolatrous practices. As it says, right, 3 times a year, all males should appear before the Lord Hashem, as if to say, when you come before me on your festivals, do not seethe your food in the manner as the heathens used to do. This I consider the best reason for the prohibition, but as far as I have seen in the books on Sabian rites, nothing is mentioned of this custom. So says the Rambam, he says, there's something in me that says this has got to be connected. Right? That when it says lo tevashel gedi b'chalei v'imo, after describing the Shalosh Regalim, there has to be a connection between the two. And I think, says the Rambam, the connection probably is that this was something that the non-Jews, that idolaters, did during their practices. Going back to the Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra says they had practices. They had Shalosh Regalim. Says the Rambam, they probably on one of these Shalosh Regalim, or on all of them, they would boil kids in their mother's milk. Therefore, after the Torah comes along and says, Tahog li, make them for me, it specifies that with regard to this practice of boiling a kid in its mother's milk, that you can't do. That's something that they would do on their regalim, but we can't do it on ours. It's quite a compelling hypothesis. It's a nice theory, Rambam, right? But, says the Rambam himself, I've been looking for some sort of evidence that this is in fact the case. He's been reading up to the degree that he could on the ancient Near East, and he's found no mention of this custom. Well, thankfully, we have a bit of insight that he didn't. And by the 20th century, we knew quite a bit more about the ancient Near East than did the Rambam. The man on your screen at the moment is a fascinating scholar by the name of Umberto or Moshe David Cassuto. Umberto Cassuto was both a rabbi and an academic, a Bible scholar. He's Italian, grew up in Florence, and actually was rising in the ranks of, he was the chief rabbi of Florence for quite some time, and then he was focusing on his academic work in Florence and then in Rome. And then a series of anti-Semitic laws in 1938 were passed in Italy, and he saw the writing on the wall, and he accepted a position at the Hebrew University, where he became the chair of their Bible studies. He's probably best known, Cassuto is probably best known for having written the first academic argument against the documentary hypothesis. That is the academic biblical, the approach of academic Bible scholars who argue that the Torah, Chamisha Chumshei Torah, was actually written by 5 different authors at different times. Cassuto is really the first one to offer a lengthy, well-reasoned argument against that, or for the unity of the Torah from an academic perspective. But Cassuto himself was an excellent scholar, was a wonderful scholar, and wrote a commentary on, I think, 3 out of the 5 books of the Torah. And look at what he writes on our passage. Referring to these 4 mitzvot, isurim, that we have at the end of the Shalosh Regalim, right after the Shalosh Regalim, he writes as follows: the purpose of this prohibition may have been to prevent the sacred meal continuing till morning, and thereafter providing an opportunity for riotous and unchaste behavior. In other words, the reason why we may have to not allow the korban to stay on the mizbeach all night is because bad things happen when you party all night. And therefore, that may have been part of the reason to take it off before the night gets too late. In the parallel passage, we find the sacrifice of the Feast of Passover. Instead of the fat of my feast, see my annotations there. Fine, next. Although the first of the first fruits of your ground, that is the best and choicest of the first fruits of your ground, you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God, just as the Canaanites bring the first fruits to the house of their gods, yet you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk according to the heartless custom that they practice on their festival of first fruits. Maimonides already conjectured that the prohibition of boiling a kid in its mother's milk was intended to keep the Israelites away from idolatrous customs, but he had no proof that the Gentiles actually practiced such things. Now we know from the Ugaritic texts that the Canaanites prepared such a dish, particularly at festal ceremonies pertaining to the fertility of the soil. In the Ugaritic tablet, on the gods pleasant and beautiful, it is written, I can't read that, but in the English, boil a kid in milk, a lamb in butter. The custom of boiling small cattle in milk has been preserved to this day amongst the Bedouins. These practices, keeping the korban on a mizbeach all night, putting chametz on the mizbeach, boiling a kid in its mother's milk at the time that you were bringing the first fruits, were all part of the way in which the idolatrous world celebrated their Shalosh Regalim. Today, the Rambam guessed at it. The Ibn Ezra said, they do it their way, we have to do it our way. Cassuto in the 20th century was able to show that, in fact, we have evidence that clearly states this is the way it was. Clearly what the Torah is telling us is that we have to do it differently. If we pause now, though, and take a step back, this gives us a slightly different picture, perhaps, of the Shalosh Regalim and its origin. Not, of course, to belittle anything about the Shalosh Regalim, but to understand sort of from 30,000 feet then, what is the Torah telling us when it tells us to observe the Shalosh Regalim? It is, in fact, a directive to engage in and elevate a popular yet profane element of non-Jewish culture. Right? Again, think about what it must have been like living at the times in which the Torah were given. This was an agrarian society. There were 3 festivals celebrated a year. These were the highlights. This was popular culture. Right? This was the backbone of how these other societies functioned. You would look forward, right, to these festivals. They would mark your year. They were the cornerstone of how people passed time. And so the Torah comes along, and rather than saying, don't do it, you may not have Shalosh Regalim, right, which we certainly could have understood it to tell us, right, or could have imagined it might tell us. Instead, it says, Tahog li, you can have but you have to make them for me. Here's how you differentiate it. Here's how you elevate it. Here's how you are mikadesh the whole. Here's how you bring a holiness to something which is otherwise profane. And so this ultimately leads us to a question in contemporary, or at least in the 20th century, how similar is this idea to the idea known as synthesis, this bringing together of different worlds that was advocated by 20th century modern Orthodox thinkers? Is this the same? Is this an excellent, example of this idea of synthesis at the very core and the very heart of Jewish tradition, or is it different? Is it a different idea, or is what was being advocated in the 20th century and is still very much advocated today as synthesis, Torah, Umada, is that something fundamentally different? So let's switch gears for a minute from commentaries on the Torah to looking a little bit at the writings around this idea. And I want to try to suggest that there are perhaps at least two different strands in this writing, one of which seems to accord quite well with this notion of the Shalosh Regalim, and the other, I think, does not. So, switching from Umberto Cassuto to a much younger contemporary of his, Dr. Samuel Belkin. So Dr. Belkin, born in Europe, comes to the United States following the pogroms, I think, of 1919, and actually rises through the ranks of academic Jewish studies. I believe he got his PhD from Brown University, one of the earliest PhDs in Judaic studies. He was also a very significant Torah scholar and becomes the second president of Yeshiva University in 1943, a position that he holds until 1976. I believe that there have been 5 presidents of Yeshiva University. The first one was Bernard Revel, right? Then Samuel Belkin, then Rabbi Lamb, then Richard Joel, and that brings us down to today. So Dr. Belkin. Dr. Belkin, here's just before we get into the writings of Dr. Belkin, this is a fun picture of Dr. Belkin. Everybody know who he's standing there with? Yeah. Okay. There, oh, sorry, I passed by it already. But yes, that's Dr. Belkin with Albert Einstein. Dr. Belkin, I believe, and somebody can jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Albert Einstein College of Medicine, which grew up under Dr. Belkin's watch, was the only institution that Albert Einstein ever gave permission to put his name on in his lifetime. I'm pretty certain of that. And this picture was taken in Princeton. There is Albert Einstein and Dr. Belkin. Okay, so Dr. Belkin, as I said, served as president of Yeshiva University from 1943 to 1976. So this is a long time. 33 years, he's the head of the institution and is very much credited for having helped unearth, unpack, and disseminate the ideas which are at the core of Yeshiva University, particularly this idea of Torah Umada, and particularly this view of synthesis. The idea of synthesis was actually a major part of his inaugural address in 1943. But here in 1963, 20 years later, some of his words were reprinted, but I want to show you this particularly fascinating a publication of the student organization of Yeshiva University. Just take a look at who's here on the cover sheet. So the staff includes, on the top there is a man by the name of Stephen Riskin, right, who will clearly be known by a different name a little bit later on, right? Everybody knows who Stephen Riskin. Somebody want to jump in there? Yes, Stephen becomes Shlomo, right? And that is Rabbi Riskin, chief rabbi of Efrat. David Berger was the secretary treasurer of the student organization at the time. David Berger, I believe, is actually now stepping down as the dean of Revel after a very, very accomplished career in Judaic studies. There you have Dr. Belkin. Under that, you have a young faculty member at Yeshiva University at the time by the name of Aaron Lichtenstein. And then you have another piece there by Stephen Riskin. It was quite a crew that had gotten together on this little publication of the student organization of Yeshiva University in 1963. But as you can see, the dominant theme here was that of synthesis. Questions which came up then, which still come up today, about to what degree can we bring these worlds together? To what degree can we live in both of them? Does the Torah want us to live in both of them? And so as these questions were making their way through the Yeshiva University student body again in 1963, they decided to reprint some of the words from Dr. Belkin's inaugural address in 1944. And let's read this little passage here together, because I think it's instructive in giving us a sense for where Dr. Belkin is coming from. When he thinks about synthesis, what does that look like? And here he writes, if we seek the blending of science and religion and the integration of secular knowledge with sacred wisdom, then it is not in the subject matter represented by these fields, but rather within the personality of the individual that we hope to achieve the synthesis. That is, the combination of these two worlds, the bringing these two worlds together, he says, doesn't happen in science or in Torah. Those remain distinct worlds. There's the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world. There's the profane and there's the holy. Where the synthesis happens is in the person who takes these ideas in. Within me, there is some synthesis, and by learning both, by learning Torah and learning Mada, I become a more robust individual, a more nuanced individual, a more sophisticated individual, perhaps somebody who can understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu or Halacha or Jewish philosophy better because I've been exposed to both of these worlds. And I believe, although he writes quite a bit and summarizing it in just a few lines, you know, certainly doesn't do any justice, but I believe that Rav Lichtenstein, who was my teacher, followed these along these very, very similar lines. And we're not going to read all of this together. But this is the article that appears there in that same journal by Rav Lichtenstein. And just look at the heading, right? Torah as a way of life, Torah study, develop spiritual personality. Then he finds some problems. The idea here is, again, to develop a Torah personality. To Rav Lichtenstein, and he writes about this, you know, many times over the course of his life. This is about using Milton to understand what it means, right, to lose one's sight. It's about the sensitivities that come. It's about how I develop myself as a personality and as a person by exposing myself to this, to these different ideas that aren't necessarily contained within the Torah itself. That is Torah Umada. So if I were to summarize, right, and again, I'm taking articles upon articles and books upon books and compacting them here, but ultimately I think that through much of the writing of the Torah Umada world, you find these two things. Number one, it is inward facing. That is, it is about what I can bring into myself, what we as Jews want to bring into our world, how we take from the outside world and allow it to enrich it and enhance the lives that we live, but it is ultimately inward facing. It's about taking it into us. And number two, it's about the formation of a certain type of personality. That's what Torah Umada is. It's a certain, it's a certain type. It's a certain perspective that I have on life because I've brought this in. I've used these in forming who I am. Now, what's fascinating, though, is that while both of these pieces in this pamphlet, it seem to be strikingly in this particular direction, which I would suggest is quite different from what we were beginning to develop in the world of the Ibn Ezra and the Rambam. There, it seemed to be a synthesis which is about my going out, right, and engaging the world around me. It's about, I'm going to take this practice, right, of the ancient Near Eastern world, of the idolatrous one, I'm going to lift it up. I'm going to make something more of it. It's not about what I'm doing to myself. It's about what I'm doing to this practice, to the society around me, how I'm creating kodesh out of chol, out there, not necessarily what I'm doing inside in me. And what I think is so striking is that back to this pamphlet again, or this journal again, they published excerpts from Rav Soloveitchik's speech to the Mizrahi Convention in 1962 as the forward to this little journal. But this piece is so strikingly different from anything else that was in this particular journal. And it is this beautiful piece here written by Rav Soloveitchik, and we're gonna read pieces of this together, and you're gonna see how this is a very, very different version of what synthesis could and perhaps ought to look like. The Rav here is giving kind of a midrashic reading of the story of Rivka, Yaakov, and Esav. And he writes as follows. Rebecca demanded from Jacob that he wrest the blessings from his father, right? Rivka tells Yaakov to go and get those brachos. Why was she so insistent that Yaakov obtain the blessings under any circumstances? Evidently, Rivka knew that if Esav were to be the only Yodei Tzayed Ish Sadeh, the only savant, technician, landowner, speaker, politician, the only one to rule over the temporal world, there would be no future for Yaakov. Lech Nael Hatzon, my son, learn how to go out into the fields. Learn how to struggle for Tal Hashamayim Umishmanei Haaretz. Do not allow Esav to rule over everything. Teach yourself how to hold the Gemara, to daven mincha, to keep the laws of Shabbos and Kashrus, and to teach your children Torah, not only in the private tents of Shem and Eber, but also in the faraway land of Haran, in the field, where with one hand you will hold the Gemara, and in the other you will hold a plow. Yaakov, the large field, need not be a place of impurity. The festivals of the idolaters need not be a place of impurity. Judaism believes that the field can become a flower garden. If only Esav, the agnostic, the vulgar materialist, the cynical non-believer will not remain in full control. Yaakov, you can bring divinity into the field. You have the power to sanctify the field. Skipping to the bottom of the next paragraph. Only Yaakov has the ability to transform the brutal, mechanical field into a garden of Hashem, into a place of spiritual joy and tranquility. Certainly it is easier to remain in the tents and never to depart the field. Certainly it is less difficult to grasp the Gemara with both hands. But when historical circumstances forces the Jew to involve himself also with the field and to hold on to a Gemara along with the model weapons of life's struggles, I'm not sure if that's what that says, but he must be ready and able to fulfill his mission. In short, Yaakov must sanctify the field. And this is a strikingly different vision for what synthesis looks like. This is not about inward facing. It's not about what I take into me. It's what I do. It's how I go out. It's going into coming to that world and being elevating it, sanctifying the field, taking this practice which was already out there and making it different, qualitatively different, because it's tachod li. It's celebrated for me, not the way that they did it, but you can take from it and do with it, but you have to make it that much more special. And in fact, Rabbi Lamb actually speaks about two different kinds of synthesis. He doesn't talk about those within the YU camp per se, but he does talk about two different versions of synthesis. He talks about a synthesis as advocated by Rav Hirsch and one as advocated by Rav Kook. And let's look at the distinction that he draws between these two, because I think they hold up pretty well for the world of Yeshiva University and the world of Rav Kook and the Dati Leumi world of the State of Israel. So each represents a different version of the synthesis, which is the most characteristic aspiration of modern Orthodox Judaism and the major purpose of such institutions as Yeshiva University. I'm going to say that again. According to Rabbi Lamb, synthesis is the most characteristic aspiration of modern Orthodox Judaism. So here they are. Hirsch, the aristocratic pedagogue, and Rabbi Kook, the poetic Kabbalist, both inspire admiration and deserve our gratitude. Yet basically, Hirsch is the cultural thinker and educator, while Rabbi Kook is a metaphysician and mystic. Hirsch's synthesis is one of coexistence, hence essentially static. Rabbi Kook's is one of interaction and hence dynamic. Hirsch is an aesthete who wants Torah and Derech Eretz to live in a neighborly, courteous, and gentlemanly fashion. Rabbi Kook is an alchemist who wants the sacred to transmute the profane and recast it in its own image. From the point of view of Rabbi Kook, it is not enough to raise a generation of Orthodox Jews who will also be cultured Western men, admirable as this ambition may be. It is not enough to bear the two cultures as parallel lines, which can meet only in infinity. It is urgent that there be a confrontation and an encounter between them. Two different versions of what synthesis looks like. The one that Rabbi Lam ascribes to Rabbi Hirsch is one in which we live with a foot in both worlds, but they're infinite lines that never meet. We have our secular world and we have our religious world. We have in our schools, we have Judaic studies and we have general studies, and they live side by side with one another. And what makes our community different than others is that we value them both, and they live, as he says, in neighborly, courteous, gentlemanly fashion. They live side by side with one another. We create these Western cultured Orthodox Jews. That was the vision of Rabbi Hirsch, and I think to a large degree continued to be the dominant understanding of Torah Umada in much of the Yeshiva University world, to the point where it has informed the way our schools look, the way in which we structure much of our lives in the modern Orthodox world today. But says Rabbi Lam, who was the next president of Yeshiva University after Rabbi Belkin, that there is another version, and that is the version of Rabbi Kook, where to be a cultured Western Orthodox Jew is not enough. But these two things have to come in contact with each other. We have to bring the values of Hashem together and confront this, these regalim of the idolatrous world. They have to, it's not enough that you would have, we could come up with two other regalim that we would have that have nothing to do with what the rest of the world did. But that's not the instructions we get for the Shalosh Regalim. No, we were told, take those three and confront them. Here are the things that you cannot do that they do. You have to take them in tachogli and elevate them for Hashem. And in fact, this is a dominant theme of Rabbi Kook's writing. And as many of you probably know, Rabbi Kook takes it probably, to what some might argue is an extreme, but he goes even further. Here's just one line from Rabbi Kook, where he writes, "HaKodesh tzarich sheyibaneh al yesod hachol. Hachol hu hachomer shel HaKodesh. V'HaKodesh hu lo tzura. V'chol ma sheyihyeh hachomer yoter itan, tiyeh tzura yoter chashuva." Says Rav Kook, and again, Rav Kook is certainly not one you can boil down to 3 lines, but says Rav Kook that the whole is necessary for the Kodesh. The Mada, in our language, the secular, the profane is a necessary for, because the holiness is built off of it. You have to start with something that is chol before you get to the Kodesh. The Kodesh, right, the chol is the chomer, it's the stuff. The profane is the stuff that things are made out of, but the Kodesh gives it its form. Right? So you have regalim, they exist. Comes along the Kodesh, Hashem's instruction to us, and says, take this chomer, take this matter, and reshape it along the lines that I, Hashem, envision for this. Right? And yes, it's going to take some of the character of those others, but it's going to, when infused with the Kodesh, is going to become something which is substantively different than what we started with. So ultimately, I think then this notion of Shalosh Regalim as something which began outside of our world, right, but for which we were given explicit instruction that said, take these three things and now redirect them to me. And where we're given specific instruction about what types of things used to be done during these, which cannot be done, right? In addition to the things that we know we must do on each of our regalim, is much better example of the type of synthesis that was advocated, I think, by Soloveitchik beautifully in that address to the Mizrahi, right? And in what Rabbi Lam ascribes to Rabbi Koch, which is this notion of a synthesis in which these two worlds don't live side by side, but ultimately encounter each other, confront each other, right? And as Rav Soloveitchik said, that's not easy. Right? It's not easy when these two things, when Yaakov is forced out of his comfort zone, out of the tent, and into the larger world around him, and to learn these things that used to be the domain of Esav, and to do so while still holding on to his Gemara. Right? That he says Rav Soloveitchik, it's much easier if I could hold on with two hands. Right? And now you're forcing me to hold on with only one. It's much more difficult. But ultimately, what emerges from doing that, what we believe emerges from doing that, is something which is that much more valuable, is something which we could not create without that type of encounter and confrontation. And so my hope is that as we go into Shavuot this year, we can come at it with new eyes. We can see that this is an example that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us, and one of the earliest ones, in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us, listen, there's a world around you, right? There's a world around you, and what I, Hashem, want from you is to engage that world and elevate that world, not to retreat from it, but to confront it, as difficult as that may be, and make it a holier, more elevated, more spiritual place. And so that's my bracha to all of you. Let us hope we can do and accomplish that over this coming Shavuot. Happy to take any questions. I know it's great to see all of you. If there are no questions, then by all means, Chag Sameach.
I did have a question, Rabbi Perl, Ruth Elul.
Please.
Very interesting, first of all. I never thought of it that way. I had a question. I understand you're saying we're supposed to Tachoguli, take the existing holidays and change them and make them our own, and certain things we have to keep away from. But my question is, on our instructions about the Chagim, maybe there or in other places, very unique to us to start with, like substantially different to start with, and it's not through that synthesis or making it our own that it becomes our own, but it's uniquely our own almost initially. And the fact that, maybe those holidays were at the same time as Near Eastern holidays, it's more a directive, to keep away from certain practices because, coincidentally we're at the same time, rather than it being of the essence of the, what we're supposed to, if you understand what I'm saying, what we're supposed to end up with, if you understand what I'm asking.
Yes, so the pasuk that says that where the Ibn Ezra begins his comments actually comes at the very beginning of the description of the Shalosh Regalim. So it's Tachogli, and now it gives us all the positive mitzvahs, right, that are involved in each of the Shalosh Regalim. And I agree with you. That's the primary differentiator between our version of these and those. It's the sukkah, it's the lulav, it's the etrog, it's the matzah, it's the carbon pesach for sure. And then at the end, the Torah throws in, and by the way, right, lest you get carried away with your with your karbanos and let them leave and let them stay all night. No, we don't do that because that's the way that they do it. And lest you think that because, hey, nobody said anything about boiling a kid in its mother's milk, so maybe we can add that to this. You can't go there, right? So I agree with you that the fundamental differentiating factor is the positive mitzvot that we have. The whole thing belongs in this context of there were 3 agrarian festivals before, right? And all of our instructions on the Shalosh Regalim are about this is how you do it for Hashem. This is how we take what this foundation that was laid and elevate it for Hashem's larger purposes. I just want to call everybody's attention to the comment in the chat from Diane. This is fantastic. Thank you for, I don't know if she's still on, but she noted here that Albert Einstein did not initially want the Albert Einstein College of Medicine named after him, but when he heard their second choice, he allowed them to name the school after him. So, but I still do believe it's true that it's the only, right, Diane, is that right? It's the only institution that he gave permission to in his lifetime. But thank you.
Correct.
Thank you.
That's correct.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.